Well, Phil Herndon, we had a great conversation last time. We just had to keep this going.
Okay.
By the way, if you did not see part one of our conversation with Phil Herndon talking about feelings and emotions and how there's these 8 core ones that we're kicking around here a little bit, you can go back and watch the part one of this conversation here and connect with Phil at tinmanministries.com. But we've talked about anger and we've talked about fear and sadness and hurt. One of the ones that I wonder if a lot of us are experiencing, but we don't necessarily recognize that we're experiencing it, is loneliness.
Yeah.
I'm
I
so
think we-
proud of you right now.
I think we began to talk about it maybe a little bit more because of COVID.
Mm-hmm.
You know, everybody go home and people began to say, well, loneliness is an issue. So maybe it's a little bit more
Yeah.
on our radar screen than
Yeah.
it was. But still, do you see a lot of people dealing with that without even recognizing that loneliness is the thing that they're struggling with?
I think we talked about it last time with hurt. I think those two are the two that are the most stealth. Because we live in, so we were just talking about it earlier today. It is so chaotic and busy and loud and noisy and people. We can get duped into thinking like, nah, man, it's impossible to be lonely. Because we think, you mentioned COVID, with loneliness. Oh yeah, I was isolated away from people, therefore I was lonely. It was not the isolation from the chaos and the people per se that was loneliness around that. Like, loneliness is that inner angst in me that says I'm really needy of relationship. Like people will say, I need people. Yes, that's true. But loneliness is, I want relationship. I'm lonely. People can move to a new city, for instance, or a new part of the country and say, I'm lonely for home.
Yeah.
Part of this movie, Steven Spielberg must have sat in his office and said, you know what, I think I want to make another billion. So I'm going to create this limbic brain out of silicone. I'm going to let him talk though. He's only going to say one thing. He's going to say, E.T., phone home. And millions of people spending $15 a head are going to go to that movie and they're going to go, yeah, me too, E.T. I'm going to make a ton of money on that. E.T., yes, he was, but E.T. was lonely. That's a movie about loneliness and a longing for home. And we went to that. I'm old enough. I think we're all three old enough to remember that movie, in the theater. And people flocked to that movie. And that movie was a huge hit because we recognize loneliness and we think, man, if I were so far away from home, I would so long for home. And we have a longing for home in us. And we know we're going to all caps home one day. God's going to make sure of that. But until we're there, we have this loneliness. And what do we long for on earth? We long for relationship. God breathed his identity into humankind. And part of that identity is made for relationship. I desire connection. And I get that. And loneliness reminds me that is very, very true.
No, when we desire connection and we don't recognize that it's loneliness, so we don't deal with it in that way. We do deal with it though. When we're looking for connection and we can't have it in a relationship, then we'll go find something else.
Yes.
And it could be something detrimental or it could be something we can control.
Both. Johann Hari, he wrote a book called Chasing the Scream. It's about addiction. He has the greatest name of a TED Talk ever, and maybe one of the greatest TED Talks. The name of this TED Talk is Everything You Thought You Knew About Addiction is Wrong.
Wow.
That's the name of the talk. And what he says in that TED Talk, he says, we need to stop calling it addiction and call it bonding. He said, the opposite of addiction is not sobriety. The opposite of addiction is connection. And he said the person in a Vegas casino is connected to the roulette wheel. And the sex addict is connected to the pornography. And the alcoholic is connected to alcohol. There is a relationship with what we are addicted to. And as a recovering guy of a lot of different manifestations of addiction, that's absolutely true. Think about what people will do. They will literally drink themselves to death or whatever, themselves literally to death or emotional death, to get to that hit they get from being connected to that chemical or to that thing. And what they're doing, among other feelings, they're attempting to find something to connect to because we're made for it. It's loneliness. And so, yes.
What happens though if someone has gone for the connection with, let's say, alcohol or drugs or something else that gives them the dopamine hit, but they have excluded the people that would connect with them,
Yeah,
but they can't see it?
that's right.
What is going on there?
That's right. It is, people connection, dopamine is almost like a spritz, a little bit like maybe as like a soaker hose. The human body is made to have little spritzes of dopamine through the day, sunrise, petting Pepper in the morning,
Coffee with Pepper
bread, coffee
every
with Pepper,
morning, yeah.
right? And so being together, having
Yep.
coffee together, like we're made for those dopamine hits like that. Well, an alcoholic, and this is part of my history, alcoholic gets that first drink, in my case, him or her, and the dopamine pipeline is opened up like no more spritz. It is flowing through the system. And so the brain goes, man, what's better than a little dopamine? A lot. And so it starts craving that. And so that dopamine hit, and then that turns into anticipatory dopamine, or addiction therapists call that ritualization. And so when the alcoholic begins to plan that drink and begins to ritualize to get that drink, that dopamine's already flowing. And so it's like planning a vacation and being on one. It's like the dopamine starts before you go. And so that connection is very, very well. And what happens is there's a part of the brain called the nucleus accumbens that is responsible for that dopamine. And there's a part connected to that called the VTA. And the VTA is the thing that controls the flow of it. And so an alcoholic, to go back to that example, an alcoholic drinks a certain amount, and then the VTA says, hey, that's a little bit too much dopamine for that. And so that's what's called increased tolerance. And so that's the reason addiction doesn't stay dormant, it grows, because we want more and more and more dopamine. And so the intervention piece is around these 8 words. Like, because what we're drinking about, we're seeking connection because it feels safer, quote unquote, than loneliness does. Because loneliness is vulnerable. Like, to say I need someone is really vulnerable. And so I drink alcohol. Alcohol is called liquid courage.
Yeah.
Literally. And so that synthetic, or that acting out sexually, or gambling, or whatever it may be, is a very strong inducer of that dopamine chemical, and those rituals get really rutted into a daily routine or whatever routine, and it's really hard to break because the brain says, well, gosh, coffee with Steve, I like Steve, I can tolerate him for a little bit, but what I'm really after is when I get rid of Steve, I get to go home and do that. That's what I'm really after.
The big dopamine hit. Yeah.
But that was the connection. Like, the connection was sitting down and having coffee with a friend. Not good enough.
No,
No.
not enough dopamine.
I'm only a small dopamine hit.
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, that other thing is a much larger dopamine hit, and so that does make a lot of sense. And so I would think a lot of us, though, may, as I hear you explain that, be like, oh, okay, some light bulbs are going on. I'm beginning to kind of get this, but without an explanation like that, I could see that just flying right over the top of my head and not getting that. And so for the person who's like, yeah, I do struggle with addiction. I do struggle with certain things, and I've never thought of it as looking for connection before. But maybe that's what I'm doing. Are there signs, red flags, things that, questions we need to be asking ourselves to figure out if what's driving a lot of this is just the fact that I'm lonely?
Yes. Yeah, and a great diagnosis for that is, how willing am I to reach out relationally? Because so many people, like, we have all these phones, we carry our phones around with us everywhere, and we so often don't use that phone to call somebody and say, hey, I need help. I'm lonely. And sometimes it's really that simple. Occam's razor, the principle of Occam's razor, the simplest solution is usually the best. And so we will lose track of that. And that's one of the reasons that in AA and the other 12-step fellowships, they will say, get a sponsor. And what's the first instruction of the sponsor? Call your sponsor at least once a day. To train people like, hey, you're going to need relationship to be true connection. And so sometimes the simplest solution is the best. Like, hey, I'm meandering off into this territory in an addictive way, or I'm just isolating with a video game, or scrolling on social media, or scrolling something, and I need people contact. And so again, phones, huge dopamine hits. I read an interview that one of the Apple developers said we were tasked with creating a device, creating something that when you checked it, you had anxiety, but you had more anxiety when you didn't. And so we created a loop around that. And so we have all these ways of not having to admit to loneliness. And so the question is, do I have people that I tell the truth to and that tell the truth to me? Do I have people that I sit down with who know me very, very deeply? If that answer is no, sometimes the simplest solution is to say, well, then I need to go find him or her. That's part of what actually got us to move here. My dad passed away, and long story way shorter, I don't say this to his shame or to dishonor his memory whatsoever, but my mother had a hard time thinking of men to serve as pallbearers because my dad was a great man, a good man, a hardworking man. He had no friends. No one knew him. And so and I remember sitting in that chair in my mother's living room and saying to myself, I am not dying that way. That is not happening. And then I had the next thought, like, if I don't get out of isolation, that is exactly how I'm going to die.
Yeah.
And so it was a real motivation. I had anger, as we talked last time. I had anger in me to say, that's got to change, and I've got to go through some pain to get it.
You talk about this, and I think you distilled it down to the answer of asking yourself the question, do I have people I can connect with? If not, I have to make work of that. And yet, as you describe loneliness and what we will put in its place, we have
It's not an easy word.
Taking on anesthesia.
Anesthetized ourselves,
Yes,
close enough, to not even understand that we're lonely,
that's right.
because you just mentioned video games and scrolling and the phone and all the things that take our attention, but they usually aren't people, person to person.
That's right.
Like the video game might be somebody online that you're talking to.
Mhm.
To me, yes, I know it's a real person, but it's kind of not.
No, it's kind of not.
It's kind of not.
Yeah.
And so, how does this generation start to go, wait, you're talking to me?
Mhm.
Wait, Phil, is this me?
Mhm.
Because that doesn't sound like me. Oh, wait a minute. Yes, it does.
Yes, right. And this is, I know the subject tonight is not addiction. However, when you're talking about feelings, you're probably going to end up there like we have. This is a real thing. Like alcohol and drugs get the publicity around it because it's medical. But if you go into a recovery process, whatever kind that is, and you've been taking drugs or been taking an alcohol, you're going to need to detox. Well, that is exactly the same with these other things. And detox is you start with abstinence, and this sounds kind of like, gee, really, but it's true. It starts with abstinence, and you do whatever you have to do to remain abstinent. And the guys at the treatment center that we had for years would say a lot of the work and treatment was over a cup of coffee at 2:30 with a guy just saying like, man, I'm going crazy without drugs or alcohol or acting out or whatever it might have been. And so that's something that doesn't get talked about very often. And sometimes accountability groups fall apart because of that, because guys meet on a Wednesday morning or whenever. And it doesn't go any further than, did you act out? Did you do this? Did you do that? And guys really don't know what to do with that. And so accountability groups would go to a deeper place. They said, we're exchanging phone numbers. I do not care what time it is. I do not care what it takes. If you're going to drink or act out or whatever, you call me first. And that's what we don't say very often, maybe particularly in church. Like this is a really like pawing the ground thing. If you are substituting for your loneliness, if you're substituting a thing or a substance or an acting out for that, you have to detox. You've got to be away from the phone, away from the drink, away from the pornography, away from the whatever, to literally detox and withdraw, because addiction wears very deep neural pathways in the brain. And so what happens in those groups is people forget the basics. Like if Steve and I can check in with each other and, oh man, having to check in with Steve again that I relapsed or did it again, whatever the it is. If I'm willing to call him to take a chance, he really means, man, you can call me at 2:30 a.m. I promise you we have a conversation. If I will take the risk to do that and Steve answers, and that happens again and again and again, and I'm doing that for Steve too, I guarantee you what we call accountability groups will take on a whole new level. Because guys are not detoxing from what they've used to make themselves okay, to have pseudo connection.
Yeah, I just think through all the groups I've been a part of that called themselves accountability groups, and they never went to that level.
That's right.
You know, like you said, maybe once a week you check in. How'd you do? But not that,
No.
what you're talking about
No.
right there. And I'm wondering, part of the reason that we don't go there is because we feel shame about what we have done. We don't want to have to admit that, yeah, I relapsed.
Yes.
And sometimes we like to use the softer language, or like, I slipped up, I had a little stumble, I had a small setback, we relapsed, right? And so I don't want to have to admit that that is what happened, because I feel the shame and the guilt that comes with that. And so when the feeling of guilt, comes, that whether I've relapsed or I've just made a stupid decision and made a mess of something, how can we process that guilt in a way that is healthy, rather than allowing ourselves to just keep beating ourselves up?
Yeah. I think that goes to another word we use a lot in the church, and it's a totally biblical word. It's the word confession. But here's the part of confession around that. If you loop back up to loneliness for a minute, loneliness says, hey, I have need of you. I have need of you relationally. I'm made for connection. I'm made for relationship. And we read confession, we think, oh, I did something bad or wrong. The feeling of guilt says, yes, you did. Guilt says, I walked across a line and committed transgression, iniquity, rebellion, sin, or just was kind of a jerk. I did idle chatter, or whatever it may be. And the confession of what I did wrong is guilt reminds me I need to do that. But the bridge between the two is, I need to confess need. And what would keep me from coming to our accountability group, if we were in one together, Steve, is if I was confessing need to you, maybe not 2:30 a.m., maybe 2:30 p.m. I'm calling you and you go, man, you call me 24/7. You got my number. And I'll call you and go, Steve, man, I'm about to go crazy. And you say, let's talk it through or whatever. So I call you at a reasonable time. If I'm making confession like that, I may not have to confess guilt about what I've done, because I may not do it.
Yeah.
Right? And so we tend to view confession just as confession of sin. Obviously, of course, that's 101. But so often I will know in my thinking brain, well, when I've committed a wrong, a sin or whatever, I just ask for forgiveness and I get it, which is true. But if we will pay attention to, hey, guilt is very, very often associated with having crossed a line that causes harm. Harm to the body, harm to a person, harm to the gospel. So many different kinds of harm. Like, hey, what if I lived in confession out of my loneliness? What if I lived in confession of need? Not so I could, Dallas Willard called it sin management. Not so I could manage my sin, but so I could be really paying close attention to the pursuit of holiness, pursuit of godliness. Not just as a moral thing, as a legalistic moral thing, but like, what if I call Steve and he had open mic to call me and go, what if we began to confess need of one another relationally? And that opened up even deeper portals for me to be able to make confession to God of guilt when I have, because I'm going to mess up. I can be as sober as I could be, and I'm going to mess up. And guilt says, hey, let's know that that's true. As Paul says, so just sin more, because that means more grace. Like, God forbid.
Yeah.
Right. And so it's not like guilt is there, like, hey, guilt is there because of the fall, and we're going to need that. But that's where particularly loneliness and guilt can kind of go together in that territory of confession. Guilt's so important.
I have two questions. One, because there's multi-generations in my world. So this applies not just to 50-year-olds, 60-year-olds, 70-year-olds. Like, this is anybody and everybody that's got any kind of life, right? And somewhat independent, maybe not completely, but this applies to all age groups, which just kind of blows my mind. Because I don't think at 18 I could have figured this out. I'm not sure I would have been able to be introspective enough.
Yeah.
But the other thing that comes to a question for me is, do you just think that we don't think it'll work? Is that why we don't do it?
Making confession?
Well, confession and connection.
Yeah.
Do I really believe that if I have a friend that's going to listen to me and contain what I'm going to say to them and stand by me like closer than a brother, that it's going to help me not do whatever I'm wanting to do? It's going to help me grow in holiness and godliness. Do you think that as people we just go, it can't be that simple?
Yes. It can't be that simple, and therefore I'm not gonna risk it.
Yeah.
You know, because faith begins with risk,
Mm.
right? Like risk and memory, and then memory becomes certainty. The God's gonna come through. Like that's what builds faith. That's kind of like three phases of it. And David in Psalm 32, with the guilt connection you're talking about, David said, man, when I was not doing what you're talking about, when I wasn't doing that, my essence wasted away, or bones in English. It means his Davidness, my identity was going away. Like, this was not good. I was rotting from the inside. And so David, in his desperation, he had a friend that loved him named Nathan. They said, you're the guy in that story.
Mm-hmm.
David said, man, when Nathan said that to me, I woke up to my need for that. And therefore, the risk was worth it. And I now have certainty that when I made confession of sin, that's when healing began.
Mm.
So yes, it's a risk.
It is a risk, and I have found that anytime you take that risk, 9 times out of 10, if not more, that person on the other end is going to go, oh yeah, me too,
Oh yeah.
or something along
For
those
sure.
lines. Like the judgment that we are expecting
Uh-huh.
is probably not going to be there, but because of shame,
Yeah.
because of guilt and shame, I don't want to go there.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe my pride is like, oh, I don't want to have to admit.
I think that's a big one.
Yeah, it's huge. My pride.
I mean,
I don't
maybe
want to have
for
to
other
admit
people.
that I did
For us,
this.
yeah, I don't know that it would be a problem for me.
No, heck no.
Yeah.
No way.
But maybe pride.
But it's huge. And so does shame come out of pride? The fact that because I have not lived up to the standard that I expect myself to live to, I'm experiencing shame?
Yes. Steve, you're on an intuition run.
All right.
Man, that's
Keep the cameras rolling then.
So I'm
Let's keep going.
pondering what he just said. Yeah, I mean, you go ahead. I'm just processing all that. That's pretty fascinating.
yeah,
So it's our own standard?
it's amazing what happens. So let's talk about healthy shame first. Healthy shame is like, hey, I've got limitation. I need all kinds of help. You know, everything's simple from, oh, you say you need some math done? Well, that would be someone else. I don't know who, but it is
Yeah,
not me.
it's not-
Right.
yeah,
So
not me either.
that's healthy shame. And healthy shame says, if someone comes to me with like a psychopharmacology question, that's not me either. And so healthy shame says, hey, there's some things I don't know how to do. Humility, which is an outgrowth of healthy shame, says, I tell the truth about my giftedness and my limitation. Both. I just tell the truth about, we call it being right-sized. I just tell the truth about both of those. I'm really good at some stuff and other stuff I'm not. If I take that, especially when the enemy gets it and twists it, what begins to happen is I see myself, where the pride comes in, Steve, I see myself as inadequate or no good because of that limitation. Like, I don't know anything about pharmacology, but I should, and I'm no good, or I'm stupid. And so 2 phrases that go with toxic shame. One is how I label myself when I have feelings, because this is the language of vulnerability.
Mhm.
And so toxic shame, when it gets toxic, poisonous, when shame gets poisonous, says I should know everything, right? And it's despising my humanness. So how I label myself when I have feelings, I'm ugly, I'm dumb, I'm stupid, I'm whatever, I'm no good. See your face. And it's despising
You might be
humanness.
stepping on my toes.
It's despising humanness. Yet another.
Ding, 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 ding.
All right, and so I don't want to be human, because to be human is to be needy. And so often pride sneaks in there to say, well, I'm just not going to confess any of that. I'm just going to sit over here in toxic shame, and no one's going to get to me, and I'm going to be right here because no one's going to know just how human I am.
Mm-hmm. When you unfold it like that and you make it make sense, then what I think I've experienced over the last 50 some years is way different than what you just said.
Mm-hmm.
Because in my estimation, you want to live for the glory of the Lord. You want to do what he's asked you to do. You want to live out the tenets of the faith and the steps that he tells you, like in Colossians 3, to press on, forget what's behind, press on. And then as you're pressing on, you fall flat on your face again.
Yes.
And the Lord's going to forgive you. You repent and he'll restore you. and you just don't want to disappoint him. Now, I know this is bad theology. Okay, let me just say right now, I know this is bad theology.
True.
But when you've grown up with this and you're
Mm-hmm.
always trying to keep the letter of the law, it's really challenging to start going through these feelings, knowing God gave them to you,
Yeah.
knowing God can handle them, and that He knows the truth about you more than you do.
Mm-hmm.
And so, over the last several years, working through all of these anger, fear, sad, hurt, lonely, guilt, shame, glad has been eye opening
Mm-hmm.
because you don't want pride in your life. Like when I realized that all of that, I hate being human, is part of my pride nature, I was like, no, like I've been fighting against that my whole life. That's not what I meant at all.
Uh-huh.
But because you just don't realize it,
Mhm.
and then the Lord in His kindness starts to show you that. It's easy though to go, okay, well now I'm just ashamed of myself because I should have known that.
Yeah. Right.
You know, so it's
Right.
like it's this
Uh-huh.
circular,
Uh-huh.
vicious cycle that the Holy Spirit will break
Mm-hmm.
for sure,
Yes.
and is breaking it in me, and I'm thankful for His work. But I do think that there's a point in time where we have to start, like you said, this is all vulnerable. And if
Mhm.
we want to grow in our relationships with one another, grow in our relationships with the Lord, we're going to kind of have to take the bull by the horns
Yes.
and say, dang, I'm angry. I have fear about this. And
Mhm.
But Phil, not everybody can hear that.
Nope.
I can't trust everybody to hear
Mm-mm.
my 8 feelings.
No.
They're either not going to care or they're going to start giving me advice. Don't need that right now.
No.
You know what I mean?
Yes. Do I ever?
Okay.
Yes.
Hear the answer on the next Dawn and Steve Plus.